you for joining us today. My name is Heather Kelly, and I'm with the Interdisciplinary Nursing Quality Research Initiative Program, or INQRI program. I'd like to just thank all of you for joining us, and of course Dr. Bradley for agreeing to present her presentation to us today via the webinar format. This series is co-sponsored by the INQRI program and the Donaghue Foundation. Lynn Garner from Donaghue is unable to join us today, but she asked me to convey her gratitude for everyone participating in the program here. I also wanted to let you know that we'll be recording this session. It will be available on the INQRI website. So if you have colleagues who are interested in slides or in actually viewing the entire presentation from our desktop, that will be available later this afternoon. It gives me great pleasure to turn over our presentation to Dr. Mary Naylor, who is the program director of the INQRI program and who will introduce our speaker.
Everybody, and I guess if some on the West Coast, still good morning. We are thrilled today to have Dr. Betsy Bradley joining us on this webinar. As Heather has shared with you, for the past few months we've been focusing webinars on this area of translation, research implementation, research dissemination, and there's probably no better person to really help us to understand the challenges and opportunities associated with that than Dr. Bradley. Dr. Bradley is Professor of Public Health, and she's the Director of the Global Health Initiatives and the Health Management Program in the School of Public Health at Yale University. Her research focuses on healthcare delivery and quality improvement. She's contributed tremendously important findings on areas of organizational change and quality of care within multiple contexts: hospitals, nursing homes, and hospices. She's pioneered a new approach that is really helping us to understand how to distinguish features of high and low performing hospitals in the area in which she's worked in cardiovascular care. The number of ongoing projects regarding health system strengthening in international settings, including Ethiopia, Liberia, South Africa, and the United Kingdom. She's a world presence, a member of the World Economic Forum, the Network of Global Gender Councils, and the Steering Committee for the Open Educational Resources and Public Health Conference. In essence, she's just a star, which I got to know a little bit. I met her not all that long ago, and we are just thrilled to have you here, Betsy, to talk with us today.
Thank you so much, Mary. It's very good that this is a webinar, because otherwise everyone would seem blushing. I appreciate everything you said. It's a very thoughtful introduction. Also, to the group that's listening, I'm more than happy to answer questions during this time or by email subsequently. So please feel that, if there are things I don't address, ask them right here or ask me later over online. I would talk today for about 20 to 30 minutes, and then it's up to questions, and I hope that the group can get into a good conversation, even though we're sort of not together in one room, because I do think a lot of the best ideas travel in groups, and so we're able potentially to learn from each other. But get the ball rolling here. As Mary said, the topic of the conversation today will be about diffusion of new ideas. What works? So I'm going to start to lay this out by thinking through what really is the problem we're trying to solve here. And the problem, when I think about diffusion, what works is, the problem really is there are a lot of very, very good ideas. Mary has researched and added many of these to our literature in nursing, and as have many, many scientists over the decades, laid wonderful ideas that are evidence-based. These are not ideas that, it just seemed like the right thing to do, but actually full, concrete, rigorous scientific studies behind ideas of what would be the best way to care for patients in a variety of conditions and facility bases. But what the problem is there's limited use of those new ideas in practice. In fact, scientists in management refer to this as the knowing-doing gap. We sort of know what to do. We've got great evidence behind it. We don't really need another study about what to do. And that's not exactly what practice looks like. Those of you who are on the phone, I assume some of you are nodding your heads at this point that you've been in that very situation where The protocols have come down. We know what it says to do, but that isn't what you actually see on patient care units. If we just went a little bit further into, is there a theory that could help us understand how to close the knowing-doing gap? What kind of theories might we look at? And perhaps the most revered, I think, theory of diffusion is by Everett Rogers, and follows this S-curve, if you will, if you're looking at the slide. And the S-curve is the curve by which new ideas get into practice, and actually is based on decades of research in many, many different industries, far beyond healthcare. Again and again, almost like a biological rhythm, we see this is the way new ideas diffuse into a population or into a marketplace. And we at the beginning that the y-axis here is the percent of the units or people who have adopted the new way. And x-axis is time, say in months going forward. And if we see this, at the beginning there's very little adoption. There might be an idea, but only a few doing it. And there's an acceleration. Then finally a tapering off where the marginal returns are really not worth the added investment. And in the end, not everybody really adopts the new ideas. And the big question here is, if we were to close the knowing-doing gap, it would be as if we were taking this S-curve and making it a vertical straight line up. As soon as you got a new idea, boom, it was completely adopted and in practice. That would be closing the knowing-doing gap. If that's our goal, then we're looking for things that influence the shape of this curve, that make it be straighter and faster. What I wanted to do is talk about a case study from which we could maybe learn about what are the best ways to close this gap, to diffuse new information quicker and more effectively. And the case study I'd like to talk about is our work in the door-to-balloon time for patients with life-threatening heart attacks. And because I'm assuming there's diversity of people on the call, maybe I'll just give a 2-second review of what really we mean by door-to-balloon time. What we mean is for patients who have got STEMI, so ST segment elevation, myocardial infarction. For people who have that condition, the cutaneous coronary intervention is really the best way, or angioplasty, the best way to clear the coronary artery of its clot and restore the blood flow to the heart. And for people with this, the balloon is really that moment in which the catheter is strung up and the angioplasty balloon expands, sort of opening the coronary artery. The door-to-balloon time, of course, is the time between when the patient arrives in an emergency room to the time that the balloon is expanded and the flow of blood is re-energized. That amount of time is strongly correlated with the patient's survival and morbidity after the heart attack. And so we look heavily at trying to reduce the door-to-balloon time to what is the national standard of 90 minutes. So the goal in this for the totality care would be that hospitals in general moved patients from the emergency room to angioplasty balloon opening in 90 minutes or less. In fact, as when we started this study of door-to-balloon time, I can show you a graph of what the data basically looked like across our country. If these is a histogram of all hospitals in the country at that time, 2002, when we began, that were performing this kind of angioplasty for ST elevation patients. And this is a graph of hospitals' performance, the x-axis being the average door-to-balloon time in the hospital, and the y-axis being the percentage of all of our hospitals that were meeting that door-to-balloon time. If you look at this, and 90 minutes is your mark, there are a lot of hospitals here not performing the way they should, despite lots of studies of all excellent kinds published in the best journals that 90 minutes should be the mark. There were still a lot performing even as fast as 2.5 hours it would take it. And of course, this would compromise their mortality rates. presented an opportunity for us to study it and then understand how might we actually diffuse information about how to reduce this door-to-balloon time. And so the method that we looked at, we would call a positive deviance study. And it is a study in which one looks for those hospitals, and have them circled here in blue, that are having exceptional performance, despite being in a community that's not having exceptional performance. So the community here would be the United States. Overall, really pretty lousy performance in these years, and yet there are some percentage of hospitals out on the edge that are really top performers, that are positive deviants, basically in the same milieu with every other hospital, but somehow getting better performance. And the question for a person doing a positive deviance study is, what's it different about those hospitals? And so the method used for this was actually a mix of qualitative and quantitative work. The qualitative work to go study these hospitals inside, interviewing everybody, spending time with them, understanding what are the hypotheses around how these hospitals might do it. Quantitative portion then, developing a survey from those hypotheses, feeding a survey to a large sample of hospitals randomly selected in the nation, and finding out really statistically those hospitals that report certain practices, what are the practices that are statistically related to what is the average door-to-balloon time in that hospital. And that average door-to-balloon time, or metric, the outcome we're shooting for, was publicly reported. So we could correlate survey responses to the publicly reported measure. We're doing this, both qualitative and quantitative methods. What emerged from these couple of studies put together were accounts to 6 key strategies that were identified, both hypothesized, they really were happening in hospitals with top performance, which gives us the sense it might work, but then corroborated by quantitative statistical information to say hospitals that do these 6 things, or parts of these 6 things, are likely to have their door-to-balloon time being shorter. And so we identified these 6 potential methods that we would say these are the best practices, and if we recommended these 6 practices or some subset of these 6 practices to be diffused in the country, we would quickly bring the door-to-balloon time down. And so that was then our goal, is we knew from this positive deviance study, we knew these are probably what should be done, but still the knowing-doing gap, how you get the take-up rate to be what we wanted. Now, a moment on before we get into then, okay, how do we get take-up from this? What is it when we look at these strategies? A couple of things are important about the strategies to note. One is that they are evidence-based and credible by the time we publish this. And it's published in the New England Journal of Medicine, so that means that regardless of its bottom line evidence rigor, regardless of that, it's also credible to people who have to implement. It'll be a characteristic we come back to. It's not just evidence-based, but actually those people who want to implement believe the evidence. And we find, of course, again and again and again, depending who you're diffusing to, the New England Journal of Medicine may be a credible source, but for other people, the New England Journal of Medicine may not be that credible a source in sort of an ironic way. So matching that credibility seems to be important and was a possibility here. The thing I'd say about these strategies is they are relatively simple, or they appear to be simple. Certainly, if we look at the very first one, having an emergency department physician or emergency medicine physician activate the cath lab, that is, decide that the patient will go to the catheterization lab and be able to get the staff there and sort of call the emergency that it's going to the cath lab without a cardiologist, save time. And actually, it seems simple. We all know in operations it's not that simple. But the perception that what we were recommending was simple is a concept that we'll come back to as well again. So take a moment now and talk about the effort still in this case study to move from what is the science into the practice, that is the diffusion of this. With a very large group of people, we organized a national quality improvement campaign sponsored by the American College of Cardiology and timed in a way that I think was important. With the guideline about 90 minutes being publicly reported, done into press in July 2006, the kickoff of the Alliance in November 2006, which was the same time as the New England Journal of Medicine paper comes out. And then, so the guidelines published, and then the full public reporting in January 2007. So this was a third concept that the harvest, or what should we call it, the ground was warmed up for something like this, given the environmental factors involved with public reporting and sort of the feel that, we really do need to take up something that we can come in line with what will be publicly reported. Now, what happened with that alliance? Within the first year, more than 1,000 hospitals joined the effort. They joined in a way that looked a lot like the S-curve, actually, with very few joining at the beginning and then a large increase and then tapering off. This distribution gives you an idea of where the hospitals were, and it very much looks like the distribution of hospitals that perform angioplasty. That's pretty much a very acted sample, a fairly random, ultimately representative, I should say, sample. 1,000 hospitals joined. There's 6,000 hospitals in the country. 1,400 do angioplasty. So most hospitals joined this within the first year. Another we took was, with this campaign, which in questions we can talk a lot more about what went into the campaign, but the types of things were webinars, as we're doing now, multiple online community with a fair amount of activity, of email, et cetera, back and forth, problem solving on the online activity. There was a mentor network. There were multiple conferences. There was a change package and sort of the technical support that goes along with a alliance or a campaign of sorts. And those were sort of the activities a hospital was offered. Our question, and again, there was a very large group of people who helped with those activities. Ultimately, the 8 different professional associations joined the alliance and were extremely helpful in passing the word and making the activities, I think, robust for users and enrollees in the alliance. As researchers, we were very interested in measuring impact. Ultimately, we wanted to know, so did the alliance ultimately do anything? And we measured this on a host of different metrics. I have one I'll show you here, but to lay out the types of metrics we were looking at is the take-up rate for the different processes, the 6 processes we were recommending. The second was the actual reduction in door-to-balloon time, and the third was mortality rates. What I'll show you is the second of these, which is the reduction in door-to-balloon time, which was our main goal. We have a mechanism by which this will happen will be the strategies that we had recommended, but the real, goal was reduce door-to-balloon time. And what this table shows is the population of hospitals, their movement over the time. So the dark bars is the distribution of percent of patients that are meeting the door-to-balloon time of 90 minutes. That's what the x-axis is in your hospital, the percent that are meeting that. So we want this to move to the right because that's more towards 100% of patients are getting door-to-balloon time in 90 minutes. So the dark bar is before the door-to-balloon alliance, and that's the distribution of hospitals in the country, and the light bars are after the door-to-balloon alliance. And it shows that, at least at the same time, one can never really show causality without a randomized trial fully, but it shows that over time there was, in fact, a distribution shift towards greater improvement in door-to-balloon time across the country. And today we know from registries that exist that up to 85% of hospitals are now meeting the door-to-balloon time where their average is under 90 minutes. And many are far exceeding that, where 80% of their patients will be under 90 minutes. So it really is a tremendous success in terms of door-to-balloon time come down. In terms of, to quickly give the background on what happened to the actual strategies. Did they use the mechanisms we thought they would use? And, our chart on that is published now. We did see significant improvement in all 6 strategies that we had recommended. Not everybody did it. So many remained getting very successful with bringing door-to-balloon time without going through the strategies. And my view on this, particularly from added work we're just now with the Safe Surgery Checklist, my view on this, which we can talk more about in question and answer, is that actually what the strategies did is they had a convening property to them. They got people to a room. They were perceived to be simple. They got people to get around a table and talk about how are we going to do this. So I think what ultimately happened is they fostered what would be a robust quality improvement effort at the hospitals to use data, to brainstorm, to get the front line involved, to do all the things we know actually helps with organizational change, so that even if the hospital did not decide to adopt every one of the recommended strategies, they still find success because they'd really gotten the core tenet of a group of leaders and frontline staff together to try to solve a problem. I do think that's why ultimately we saw door-to-balloon time succeed tremendously. We saw some fairly significant take-up rate, but not perfect take-up rate of the strategies. In terms of mortality, absolutely mortality in patients with STEMI has been coming down over this time. It's very hard to tie that to a single initiative like the Alliance or even a single improvement like door-to-balloon time, since there's so many other things that have gone down, that have also improved in terms of bringing people's mortality after heart attack down as well. But the chart about moving mortality looks very much like the one you see in front of you. Measured impact. To just take a few minutes to now talk about, given this experience, what we say would be a good blueprint for the dissemination piece, which is so important when you're trying to diffuse a new project. What do we have to think about in terms of crafting a good dissemination effort, one of which I would say is something like this Alliance? And I'd say there were 5 critical pieces of the dissemination process that made this more successful. This is informed by an in-depth review, under review now, of 12 hospitals, some that found the Alliance very successful and some that didn't really find it that successful. We tried to understand what is it that is common that makes people think that a dissemination can be successful or not. And these were the adjectives and the nouns we'd come up with. 1, it's credible. What's being recommended is credible. We talked about that. And that may not always be that it is published in the New England Journal. It may be my neighbor is doing it, and therefore it's credible. You've got to think about who's the user here and what do they perceive to be credible. The simplicity. And that really should say perceived simplicity, since we know nothing is simple on this list. That it's simple enough that people can talk to each other about it in the hallway, and it can motivate people to come together to meet. It's not so complex that they just get discouraged and don't even try. The thing is that the recommendation is aligned with strategic goals of the adopters, and in case, as we talked about, having the looming threat of being publicly reported to be a guideline was innovation to sort of align the strategic alliance with the door-to-balloon alliance with the strategic goals of the hospitals, the strategy being we've got to come in compliance here with this publicly reported measure. That's an important fact in designing diffusion efforts. The 4th is that practical tools are given, that it's not theoretical pie in the sky, but there's a clear practical step 1, step 2, step 3 that people can follow like a recipe. That alone, the recipe won't work unless it's credible, but if it's credible, a recipe is a wonderful thing. The 5th, people talked a lot about this, is having a network. Just as INQRI and Mary has done so well with this effort, having a network that shares and collaborates and competes, some too, The network helps people compete, so while we did it, I could do it. The network seemed very important for organizational learning and keeping people engaged. I think something we learned through this, regardless, is some people will never be influenced. And we learned this, it is totally consistent with the S curve, and we learned that ultimately these were very common quotes to codify kind of what is about those hospitals that just wouldn't change with an alliance, no matter what the evidence was. And those were the hospitals that said, well, we already do that. Even though they didn't really do it, and their survey said they didn't, they might perceive they do. So that's a second was a hospital that said, well, we're already good enough, there's no need to change. Now, that totally flew in the face of their data, but they might perceive we don't really need to change because we're doing just fine. Or the third one that, well, it's a good idea, but it won't work here. Others' experience is not relevant here because we are different. So closing off to the outside information and a feeling that it only can work if it's built here. And I guess that would be another thing that we heard, where these would be ultimately what we would call, from a theoretical point of view, as laggards. They're not going to change. Ultimately, from this work, we ended up creating a model of diffusion, and actually we've just finished a full review of all of the quality campaigns we can find published to identify what are the common features of them. And we believe this very much captures the that create for an environment that will diffuse a new idea as fast as possible and shut the knowing-doing gap as much as possible. And the 4 buckets, one at the top being the features of the innovation itself. You know, the relative advantage. Do people perceive it's more advantageous than the current? Is it compatible with what already exists at all? Is it perceived to be simple? Can it be tried in a pilot and then not really done the whole thing? Observable, what the impact is. The features of innovation, of the innovation itself, are very important and are for sure documented over decades through Rogers and many others. Bottom of the curve of this picture, the features of the adopting organization, the hospital itself, will help us tell us something about how quickly something will diffuse. Internal champions. Is it a learning organization? Do they have enabling structures that foster adoption? Like, are they part of an alliance? Are they part of something like INQRI? Or left, what does the environment look like? Is the thing you're trying to diffuse aligned with the external environment? In other words, are economic incentives to take this up? As really with door to balloon time, nobody wants to lose their AI patient population. It's a lucrative business, if you will. Are there regulatory conditions? And were, because JACO liked the fact if people were working on door to balloon time, you know, if you wanted chest pain center accreditation, it helped to be part of the alliance. And of course, it was publicly reported. And then there are professional norms in the external environment outside your hospital that would support what it is you want taken up. Certainly having the ACC as a profession in cardiology be sponsoring this would align it with the professional norms. Last, on the right-hand side of this picture, is actually the dissemination strategy. And you'll see that these are very many of the similar characteristics I talked about emerging from just the Door to Balloon Alliance on the last slide. But in addition, these other strategies were apparent as we just have completed the review of some of the other alliances that have been successful, at least in the United States. So, you know, some of these, is it simple evidence-based recommendations? Is it aligned with the strategic goals? Those are things we had found from the beginning. Is there a nodal organizational structure, in other words, a network? I can read the others that are on this that I think we pretty much have covered, but I think are now emerging more completely with other initiatives as well. My slide is just sort of reflections that maybe I hope will spawn some questions from people on the phone. That first, diffusion requires a lot more than a good idea based on scientific evidence, which I'm sure everybody on the phone recognizes. It's a sad thing for academics to face that, but clearly it is true that a good idea alone is not enough. The second reflection would just be the practical tools are needed to connect discovery, which comes so often out of academics or comes out of a single team or group, but to connect that to widespread use. Internationally, we call it scale up. Here we call it national widespread diffusion. I think that the connection of that has to be these practical tools that run on clinicians and managers' frontline realism and feasibility. That I can't say enough about that. And my last reflection would just be somewhat of a paradox, that there is a bit of a paradox of being on the outside, which I consider academics often to be, but I think executives and team leaders can even be out on the outside. We might have ideas and evidence and have the vision of what needs to happen and the resources to be able to enable this. But ultimately, the diffusion and the take-up is a two-way street. For us in the Alliance, it took not only a wonderful alliance, all the boxes in place, but it took the adopting hospital, the organization. They have to be of a certain kind in order for the diffusion to happen. And I think in a micro scale, we could make the same analogy that team leaders, executives, clinicians might have all the vision and the ability, but it's a two-way street. The front line ultimately has to be the ones to want to diffuse and make this happen. It can't happen. It never happens by a single discipline, a single stratum in the hierarchy, etc. And that's sort of paradoxical because we think reps have all the power, but really, or the outsiders must have all the expertise and power, but they have no power without a fully engaged two-way street all the way to the very front line where the patient and the single clinician are working. I'll just thank you for the time. I think we have about 20 minutes for questions, 25 minutes for questions, and I would be happy to answer anything that could be helpful.
Thank you so much. It's a fascinating presentation, and I'm sure we have quite a few questions. Now unmuted all of the phone lines, so you're all free to speak up with your questions, or if you prefer to submit them via the chat box, you can do that as well.
Betsy, while waiting for that, I would love you to reflect a little bit on our experience as a team, which is certainly not the scale at all of yours, but trying to influence change within different systems around care transitions, et cetera. And one, I don't know if it's a cultural barrier that we seem to confront, is this sense, even with organizations who are who seem to be, for whom there seems to be a great fit in the innovation, et cetera, the organizations seem to want to be able to be the innovator and really struggle with, at least this is our experience, struggle with this notion of adoption of it. So that they all want to do a lot of change. Some of the change, of course, is the adaptation to the organization, its missions, goals, and that's reasonable. But at the end of the day, sometimes to call it their own and not to want to identify with something that didn't come from their organization. Have you confronted that at all, or?
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely, and not just in this project, but in several others. Sort of a good story about this, and I think this is published, so it's reasonable to say out loud in a group, is our hospital life program, which was Sharon Inouye's innovation about reducing delirium.
For help, yeah, sure.
Classic what you're talking about, because we did a diffusion study on that, and some of the hospitals that are known for the very best geriatrics and want to make it themselves were exactly the most complicated and impossible to diffuse help to. And I think in large part because they felt like they had team leaders already. They had innovators. They had people that they thought, and they also had difficulty believing the randomized trials, because they would even say, well, our comparison group isn't like that comparison group. So usually the New England Journal of Medicine isn't right, because I didn't really buy that control group in that study, because at our hospital, they're much better ready, so we don't need this new thing. Right. So I think there are many, and I think as disseminators, best approach is to try hard not to make it an either-or. Try hard to sort of balance the polarity between mid or buy. And because in the end, and this is very much related to in our alliance experience, we said do these 6 things, and we can tell that a lot of people had a lot of success doing 2 of those and not the other 4, because they thought up something that would work in their place. And it's discouraging, it's hard, we didn't think it should go that way, but on the other hand, I don't think we want to squelch the kind of innovation that organizations have. And in the end, I think seeing it as both and rather than either or will be our best bet to create the kind of both homegrown innovation and learning from outside. We need a little bit of both, and you hope that they calibrate themselves.
All right, perfect. And Betsy, just a little follow-up. Are you the lead author on that article?
Which article?
The one you referred to, you said on the Sharon Inouye's dissemination assessment.
Yeah, I think I am the lead author on that. There are a couple of them, but Mary, we could follow up and I could direct you to one that makes the most sense. But yes, I think I would be the one, yep.
Terrific. Thanks so much.
Looks like a question from Robin Newhouse. Hands raised, Robin. Did you question or get your question answered? Let's see. Looks like we have a question from Jay Horton.
This is Jay Horton. Hi, Betsy. I have a question. I'm working now at NYU with Liz Capizzi and looking to look at some of the niche data. And I'm thinking about a process similar to yours, especially at the qualitative end. And wonder if you could tell a little bit more about what that process was like, sort of generating those hypotheses about, and what kinds of, did you do focus groups, or how did that process work?
Sure, thanks. What we did is, first, I think, identify what you really would consider the top performers. Something that I have seen can happen is people are a little sloppy about identifying the top performers, and they start to go by kind of hearsay, anecdote. Well, he's a great leader, so he must be. Let's go see him. I think having some rigidity about, no, you got to meet these, door to balloon time. What will be the metrics for very niche approaches? So being able to really identify a top performer, you have to have that first. Assuming you're comfortable with that has happened, I think the next thing is we did in-depth interviews, not focus groups. We did in-depth interviews with anybody who was related to doing the door-to-balloon process. So that usually ended up being 10 or 12 different people. We sent teams of 3 to 4 researchers, multidisciplinary in nature, with a discussion guide that would have 5 large questions on it. Good to sort of prepare that ahead of time so that you're pretty systematic in how you do it. And then we let people tell the story relative to those questions that they did, transcribed that data, and then analyzed it using a qualitative data analysis approach. And again, I could definitely refer you to a couple of papers on the method that might be helpful. But I think maybe one of the most important things to remember in doing that is to just be a passive listener. In other words, let them tell their experience, even if their experience does not seem to be objective and does not seem to be what you think. Letting them tell their experience is extremely helpful, and getting the researcher to be very open. That's, I think, where the aha moments come up. So I'd much recommend that. And, of course, pulling off a full qualitative study does take some resources, but I think there are all kinds of phases of it that can be done, and you can learn a lot from that. I'd be happy to talk more about it if you want to get into that detail or refer you to some papers.
Thank you very much. Yeah, the papers would be helpful as a starting place.
Okay. So, Mary, do I send that to you? Or?
Yep. Why don't you go ahead and send them to me? Right.
Had another question submitted by Susie Beck. She said, there are many interventions that, quote, jump the curve without an intense diffusion intervention, for example, iPhones. Can we learn from this?
Yeah, absolutely. This is a really important concept. What a good question. iPhone the internet, you name it. There's many like that. So I think that if you have the kind of idea that really often is taken up by venture capitalists even, the kind of idea that is extremely profitable, it really solves a problem, and there's very little downside to it. Like, it's a no-brainer. I don't think there has to be any push because it puts itself. It's like an idea that has legs. But I think we're very rarely in that situation when we're talking about complex organizational change where, frankly, somebody's losing something that someone else is gaining. So when we say let the emergency medicine people activate the lab, the cardiologists are losing power. They're losing control. They're losing sleep, too, because they've got and then we say you have to be in 20 minutes. There's some push against it. When we're not that overall we think the society would be better with it, but there's a push against it. I think when we have kind of situation which is much more common in our fields, then I think we need this sort of conscious diffusion approach. If we're not in that kind of a situation, no need to spend the money. And this is, of course, foundations often say is, well, geez, this is a good idea. Can't we just publish it and be done? But I think most of our interventions have a few more barriers than something like the iPhone has, something that has a market. We're really talking about things that don't necessarily have a market that will promote the diffusion automatically through our capitalist system. Does that address the question?
Yes, thank you. Like Robin is now connected a little bit better. Robin, are you there?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I got you now.
Oh, good. Okay. I heard your clear support for champions being important in professional norms and certain kinds of organizations. Can you tell us a little more about the teams that were successful? For example, when you think about champions, I assume there had to be at least one MD and perhaps a nurse or other disciplines. Were there depth to the teams that were more successful? Was there something about the teams that we can learn from?
Yeah, that's a great question. We actually did a lot of analysis of the variables in the team. Some of the variables we looked at were how many people were in it. We looked at how often they met. We looked at whether they had a physician. We looked at whether they had a cardiologist and an emergency medicine physician. We looked at whether they had nursing on it or not. Of course, every team had nursing on it, so that was not distinguishing. And we guessed how important that was. My sense is it's critical. We also, the one other variable that we looked at was really how the team is connected in to a senior management group, just from all the literature on this. And in these, across these variables, the thing that really did not matter was how big the team was. And that was probably the least important issue. The other thing that seemed to not matter was how frequently they met, at least how they reported, which surprised me. It might be overshadowed by something in addition. The things that actually were fundamentally important was the physician being there. And in a study, it was both physicians. They worked better when they had cardiology and medicine in the same room and could duke it out. And the other variable, again, I think we have to put nursing aside, not because it's not important, but we couldn't test it. My sense from every work I've done is having nursing there, frontline nursing there, is absolutely, absolutely critical. But the other variable that sort of emerged from the teams is that the teams used data and they had a lot of conflict. It was very interesting. The productive teams absolutely had arguments, absolutely had conflict, but they also were extremely data-based. Can't get away from that. And that's very similar to the work we've done in other areas of cardiology as well.
That's interesting. So the concept of productive conflict, so they're able to drive their diverse decisions by data.
Absolutely. That is fundamental what these teams did. Because we had the quiet teams that never really had any arguments. and didn't really, and that just a bit. And we had the explosive teams that, fought constantly, and they would describe themselves, it's very political. It's very political. And would be very much in contrast to the teams that fought all the time, but they'd say, well, you know what, we have this report, we go through it every 2 weeks, and this is where we look. If something falls out, this is how we do it. So it was, I would call it productive conflict and safe conflict. Also, very much the teams who used data had gotten to that place where, okay, it's all about the process, it's not about Dr. So-and-so, and that seemed absolutely critical for them.
Thank you.
I have a couple in the queue. The next one is from Karen Lee. She asks, did you find that top performers became top performers in other areas of quality? In other words, did improving door-to-balloon time lead to adopting a CQ approach for other processes?
That's a great question. I would love to get quantitative data to study that because you have both hypotheses. You have actually that spending so much time on door-to-balloon time, you don't spend any time on geriatrics anymore, and you've got all the problems there. That's like a crowd-out hypothesis. On the other hand, you have the spillover hypothesis where, well, we did it there, now we can do it for stroke. Qualitatively, the evidence was much more in a spillover hypothesis, support of that, in that, and stroke is probably the number one place. We learned how to make the reports, we learned how to do things in a timely way, we learned how to collaborate across different physician disciplines that they had previously not talked to each other, and that really helped us with stroke. But I think that we don't really have yet what would be the evidence that if you do well in one quality metric, you do well in another. We're trying to study that, but my sense is the answer is more yes, it's synergistic rather than it's a crowd out of other things. But as I say, we have just sort of got qualitative data on that.
It looks like Ursik has a hand raised. Mary, do you have a question?
Yeah, I wanted to ask two questions if I had time. One is I'm doing a diffusion study in nursing homes, and so there are obviously some cultural differences there. But I really struggled with how prescriptive to be. On the one hand, actually I'm doing two interventions, and both offer lots and lots of suggestions to use or to enhance pain assessment and management in nursing homes. But found is it was almost too much. In some ways, organizations wanted a very specific, do this, because they really have the energy or the time to do a lot of exploration. Can you comment on the relative benefits or disadvantages and advantages of flexibility versus prescriptive kind of approach?
Yeah, definitely. It's a little like Mary's first question. I'm always going to come down on you need both as opposed to one or the other. But your relative point, I think that if there's really good evidence behind a recipe, I would go wholeheartedly on that. And it'll be easy for you. Here's a recipe. Let's get started, particularly if they're a little apathetic, as you were describing. I'd say start somewhere. See an observable improvement, and then you might figure out after that some other creative things you can do. Mm-hmm. But what I would absolutely avoid is to overwhelm them. That's why I say perceived simplicity. Yeah. And I think 6 is almost too much. 5 is a good number for the human brain to adapt. And fooling ourselves if we think they ever get together and only do those 5. They're always going to think of new ideas and new ways they get going on something. But I do feel like coming back to something simple is important, assuming you can get the evidence for that. If you get the evidence for it, then, I think all bets are off on it.
Okay. Can I also ask, so in these nursing homes, in one of the projects, we're working with some rural nursing homes in New York State, and we gave them some web-based resources because they're rural, and the point being, it's hard to reach these places. And the use of these has really declined, and yet then we had a face-to-face meeting. Face-to-face meetings are expensive, and yet it was compelling for them, and we saw this huge increase and lots of activity and creative solutions. Can you also comment when you're looking to diffuse something nationally with technology such as this is really valuable, but then at what point do you say face-to-face is important?
I'm happy to comment on that from two perspectives. Internationally, we definitely face this issue because how many times can we fly to Africa? And then also in the Door to Balloon, we had the opportunity to download on the online community every email that was ever sent and analyze it. So by date, by who sent it, by what time of day they sent it. So we have these great patterns of how an online community lives. And what's very interesting is we laid that pattern on top of what we had done in face-to-face. And your experience exactly echoes the experience of the online community. When we had just had a conference or we had just had a face-to-face type thing that a lot of people could go to, there was a huge blip up in all the online stuff. But pretty much every 3 to 4 months, we had to do something else face-to-face. And that's kind of the periodicity. Pending. I don't have enough experience to really say. I would say that's kind of the periodicity of our international work, too. Boots on the ground everywhere really helps a lot to provide energy back to what can be done online.
Great. Thank you.
Welcome.
Do more questions? Okay. Hearing none. Thank you so very much for participating today. And Dr. Bradley, thank you. This has been a wonderful conversation. And I will, as I mentioned, put the presentation up on our website at INQRI.org. In addition, if you have any other questions afterwards, you can submit them to me, and I'll get them to Dr. Bradley as she offered for follow-up. So I'll put my address up here, and if anyone has any other questions about the INQRI webinar series, I'd be happy to answer those as well.
Thank you so much. It's really been an honor to be able to talk with you all, and best wishes.
Thanks so much. Just terrific as always.
Thanks.
Bye.